So day 3 of teaching the seniors. Want to do a quick summary again um, of teaching these kids young adults that are ready to go out and live life, and sharing just the material we discussed today. And I had to move a few things around. I knew several of the seniors were going to be gone this Thursday and Friday, so I used some of my, what I call it, the capstone material. I had to move it to Wednesday because I wanted to capture and make sure that all of them heard some of this important material. And so the first 2 days, I'm building up momentum and talking to them of how they can own their first rental property virtually almost for free, that it costs them to live there. And so I showed them that example. But one of the students had asked me, what would be the steps to get started? So I had to create a few steps, and I went over those with them, and I've got my notes with me. But I said, number one step you have to have is self-discipline. Same for us as adults. We have to have self-discipline to get started owning rental properties. And I would say even self-discipline to continue to purchase rental properties, not living out of them, but to save money back to buy your next one. That's what it takes, is self-discipline, and that affects everything in our lives. So we talked about self-discipline. The number 2 thing is to set up a separate account to begin saving money. And I talked to them about opening up, maybe it's a brokerage money market account where they have it auto drafted from their account, so that it's not in their main account, that it's just part of life, that they include that in their monthly budget, that auto draft of that money coming out, and they begin saving it. And I suggest to them, as here they are seniors, and for the next 4 years, maybe most of them are going to school, that as they're working, that they start putting a habit of putting back 50% of their money as they're living at home, or have their parents helping out with college, or whatever the situation is, getting started in life, but living on 50%, and begin building that nest egg, starting at $1,500 and growing from there. That is their goal, to get to a higher number. We talk about that for the down payment of getting to $15,000 over the next 2 years. The other things we talked about is 3 common things people waste their money on. We talked about eating out. Most of these kids, they're eating out a lot and spending their money on fast food. Talked about cars. I had one of the students ask me about how much you should spend on cars, and I recommended initially, if you're, some of these, their parents bought them their first car, but if they're having to use their budget with their money should only be 1/3 of their annual income. That would be what I recommended for the kind of vehicle that they purchased, and that we're using, when we talk about best practice with budgets, I'm talking to them about making $48,000 a year and their take home being close to $3,000. So everything I'm discussing when I'm discussing these scenarios is based off of best practice. So we talk about best practices, having their housing at 15% and their housing at 25%, and their transportation at 15%. And then the last thing is spending money on vacations. Those are the things where people waste a lot of money. So we talk about that. So setting up self-discipline is the first, is building those habits now. And I'm talking to them as young adults. Let's create this habit now. It's much easier to create the habit before you have bad habits and having to change them. So I'm saying recreate the habit, or start the habit now before you have it. It then becomes part of life, starting with that savings account that's a separate account from their main operating account. And then the final thing, number 3, is begin working on credit. And I talked about the importance of credit, even for your car insurance. And I talked about having a secured credit card, but being very wise with it, not spending and leaving a balance. I did talk about what most credit reporting agencies want to see, is some little balance. So I made a suggestion for them, be it a $500,000 secured credit card, pay it off every month, but leave a balance of around $50 or no more than $50, but somewhere around $50, so that that reporting is correct and helps grow and increase your credit score that much more to get started establishing credit. The next thing we talked about was the ability, the willing to do what others aren't willing to do, so that you can live like others want to do. So we talked about that, the power I used. I want you to be, many of those students are in athletics. I said, I want for you to be a financial athlete. What makes the greatest athletes do well is because they're willing to do work on their sport outside of practice. And I was sharing my background. I played college tennis. I was willing to practice outside of practice and do it when no one else was around because no one wanted to do it. And I got the rewards. I said, I want each one of you students to become a financial athlete, that you're willing to go through the, I said, it's simple, but it's not easy. You're willing to be good with your finances, doing now what others aren't willing to do at your age, so that you can live like what those others want to live. You paid that price of learning how to handle your money, starting with savings at 20%, is what I call best practice with budget. And we talked about scenario of take-home pay of about $30,000, that they're saving $600 a month. But when they're living at home, try to save 50% of what they make. The next thing we talked about, I used a real scenario of a duplex that sold right here locally in the last 5 months. And I picked that scenario and I showed them where the lending laws have changed recently for people that don't have rentals. This was designed especially for people that don't have their first house, that they will count towards your income a percentage of the rents. And I said, this loan was especially valuable to you as Gen Zers to get your first property and want to get you on your property ladder. Some of them are not going to college. I said at 20, giving them a couple of years to save up that 15, 20,000. In our area here in Texas, I said, you're going to be putting 3.5% down plus the closing costs. And we came up with that dollar amount plus the rents. And I showed them on a monthly basis how much the rents would be to rent out one side. And these were 2-bedroom, 2-bath type of duplex. Rent out one side, rent a room to maybe a friend on the other, and you're living in one room. And showing them with the math that they were able to have that property after the course, the down payment and the purchase, but be able to live there. And it came out to around $250 a month. And I didn't talk about they'll be splitting the utilities on that side with whoever they're renting the room to. So there's additional savings not having to pay the utilities for the whole side. So we showed that $250 on a budget of $3,000. I said best practice at 25%. So you're looking at $750 allocated towards housing. So now you're taking that savings of that $500 plus the $600 you're already saving, you're putting that back in that separate account. So now we're looking at around $1,100, and for 2 years, saving that money being representing about $26,000 plus the interest you earn to purchase your second one. So we went through all the math and explaining principal and interest, explaining a loan, 3.5% down plus closing costs, taxes and insurance, and all the incentives, this being your homestead where you live, you're paying a little bit less in property tax. I was going through all those scenarios, sharing with them how they could get on the property ladder much faster, and explaining that loan product that has been, the rules have been changed for that specific age group to get into their first property faster. So those were some of the discussions for day 3 here on Wednesday, what we talked about. Hope this was enjoyable and interesting, and maybe you've got some teenagers that you'd want to have listen to this. This is some of the discussion, and I'll be doing these every day. Till next time. One last thing I forgot to show you, and I think this might be interesting. I'm going to have to pull this up. I gave each one of them this document of what somebody that's wise with their money, how they dress, versus somebody that doesn't have any money and is basically poor and probably living on credit cards. I showed this to them, and I thought that was important. I found this document online, and we talked a little bit about that, what it looks like for somebody that's good with their money versus somebody that's blowing their money. And that document showing what basically a rich kid, a poor kid that's dressed so nice and wearing thousands of dollars of items with what they're wearing and the things that they have, versus somebody average that is very good with their money. So I thought I'd add that also.